Welcome everyone to Singray's webinar of the month. We're talking about the magic of backlighting with Nikhil Bahl and a little bit about our presenter tonight. Nikhil Bahl is a full-time professional photographer, author, educator, workshop instructor, and environmentalist residing in the Washington, D.C. area. Drawing on inspiration from nature, Nikhil adopts novel approaches and seeks meaningful interpretations to create photographs that transcend the commonplace, reflect deeper insights, and convey an enchantment of the subject's beauty. An offshoot of Nikhil's fine art photography and love of nature is his documentation of wildlife behaviors and habitats. As a volunteer with the National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, his goal is to portray environmental stories with an artistic appeal. So his photographs educate and motivate about the imperative of conservation. And each year, Nikhil leads several photography tours and instructional workshops in the United States and abroad. His teaching encourages participants to advance beyond ordinary photos and develop their own style and vision. Nikhil is a regular speaker at photography clubs, expos, and industry events. He's authored the acclaimed ebook Creative Interpretations. He writes articles on creative and technical aspects of photography, and his work has been published in a number of print and electronic media. And his fine art prints have been widely exhibited in the Washington metropolitan area and are part of many private collections. So with that, I'll let you take it, Nikhil.
Great. Thank you so much for the intro. Um, Thank you all for tuning in. I'm excited to be talking to you about the magic of backlighting. It's one of my favorite ways to photograph subjects, and I'll jump right into it. A few things that I'll be talking about is why choose backlighting, using the light source in the photo, silhouettes, creating mood, and some challenges that we face as well. So why do we choose backlighting? Well, in its very basic form, I guess what I'm personally trying to do is I'm just trying to look at a familiar subject in just a different way. And even with this particular image, it's not very strong backlighting, but as you can see, the light's coming from behind the bird. And I'm trying to capture some kind of action, some kind of behavior, and having the bird's beak open definitely adds some interest to the photograph as well. But you can still see a fair amount of detail, which is not always visible in a backlit photo. And I'll have some more examples to kind of show you. But this is kind of, in its very basic form, I would say this is a backlit shot that we kind of want to start off with. Then you're talking about much higher contrast situations where you could use like rim lighting. Here, this is a guanaco in South America, in Chile. And because the sun was setting and it's literally just about to go over the mountains there, and I had the right angle here where I was getting really strong contrast and backlighting on this guanaco. And of course, by getting that strong contrast, now the attention goes more to the shape of the guanaco, which again is, in this case, desirable because I'm trying to get the guanaco's feet visible. I'm trying to get the head and the ears visible, and just general shape of the animal so that it's identifiable. Now, this is what I really love about backlighting, where you can take something that's basically ordinary, in my opinion. I would never have photographed these grasses had it not been for the light. And of course, there's a little bit of the conditions as well. There's some dew on the grasses, and I was literally waiting for something to happen, and I decided, hey, let me point my camera to the grasses and see what I can come up with. And I'm like just trying to get some kind of order in my photograph in terms of the composition. And I took this image and I thought to myself, wow, I would never have photographed this otherwise or even looked at it. But because the light was so beautiful in terms of the color, and of course the backlighting on the dewdrops makes those orbs, all of those combined now suddenly make this photograph, at least I can show it and say, hey, that's kind of interesting, while otherwise it may not have been. So I'm always trying to transform the subject. And in this case, this is taken almost at sunset, and this is in the Smoky Mountains. What I love about this particular image is the fact that there's so much depth being created. You notice how the dark layers in the foreground kind of fade and not fade, but kind of progress into the lighter layers towards the top of the image. And that creates that sense of depth. And that's nothing but the angle of light is obviously different on each one of those layers of mountains. And that's what causes that. And it's something that I often look for in my images as well, is trying to look for layers, because that's a great way to kind of create depth in your images and just move the viewer's eye easily through the image. So backlit elements. So I already have a common turn chick right here, and I've got that same rim lighting like I had for the guanaco. And I think that looks great, but now I'm trying to include other elements in there. Now, those elements are not just out of focus, but they're backlit as well. And that's what causes them to look the way they look in this particular image. And it's something that I really enjoy doing, because it's you can still see that they're grasses. You can see the orbs, which are the dewdrops, but they're rendered in a very different fashion just because they're out of focus. But the backlighting kind of helps bring some of that, almost like a little bit of the grasses become more visible because of that.
So this is
So
obviously taken in the morning, but if you're looking for natural backlighting, is there certain times of day where you'll find that more?
I tend to lean towards early and late in the day, and you'll see as I go through the images, a
Yeah.
lot of them will have a lot more color as well. It's very hard to backlight something at high noon because the sun is so high. So generally when the sun is lower, we can have subjects that are, well, we have more options, I should say, when it comes to subjects that could be backlit. While as the sun gets up higher, obviously, you know, unless we have a bird flying, etc., it can be kind of hard to find subjects to
Right.
backlight, sorry. And so this is kind of a progression of that last image, and I'm trying to capture action and behavior at this point. I'm still using those same techniques that I used in the previous image, but instead of the static bird, I now have a bird that's, you know, jumping up, kind of begging for fish or food, really, and possibly with an adult flying over. So just makes things more interesting when you capture action and behavior. But once again, I'm still using this is the exact same situation where, and it's almost the same chick, I think, I don't remember exactly, but even if it's not, it just goes to show you how something that's fairly static and just kind of standing around, and then you have some behavior, and it just creates a lot more engagement in the photograph. Now, when things kind of come together, when you're using action, but you have the right kind of light as well, you combine that, and you can kind of create this more dynamic image. And this is a photograph of these canvasback ducks during a feeding frenzy taken right around sunrise. And as you can see, because of that feeding frenzy, the water is splashing up quite a bit. And I was just shooting away because this is one of those things where you can't quite capture what you see if you see it, because, you know, these moments just pass so fast. And if you look, what makes this photo to me is having these two canvas backs kind of right here to anchor the image on the corner. And then of course, you know, I have the repetition in the background, and the backlit water, I think, adds a lot to the image as well. So it just tends to have a more dynamic feel to it rather than a very simple kind of backlit image.
And are you using auto ISO in these images?
No, I pretty much shoot full manual. I rarely shoot auto ISO. Auto ISO is something I use only when the background is not changing. So for example, if I had the sun behind me, so I'm in a typical front lighting shot, and I had a shorebird that was, you know, running around in the sand, and I knew that the background would not be changing. I would just have the sand in there. then I would shoot auto ISO. That's a good situation. Most of the time I'm just shooting manual because I want to be able to follow the subject anywhere. And that would allow me to essentially point in any direction and get the exact same exposure. It doesn't matter what the background is. With auto ISO, what happens is it's taking into consideration everything that's in the photograph. So if your background changes, your exposure will change, which essentially means you will get inconsistent exposures as you're shooting the animal or bird, whatever the case might be, moving in the image. So I generally avoid that, and I recommend people avoid it, but I think sometimes it's just easier. And if you don't mind getting a few shots, blown out or, underexposed, whichever way it might be, then it could work for you. But most of the time, I much rather shoot manual, especially when the light's staying pretty consistent. Auto ISO can also be good when the light is not consistent. So you have a situation where the sun might be going in and out of the clouds constantly, and it can almost be very hard to keep up and constantly be changing your manual settings. In those situations, I think sometimes a semi-automatic mode like auto ISO will work to your advantage. I was actually going to ask, I'm going to switch to the next kind of section. Were there any other questions about the images that I've shown so far?
Yeah, for wildlife images, do you ever use fill flash to help fill in a few details against the backlight?
I used to use not in a backlit situation. Usually I will never use that because I'm kind of exposing for the brighter areas and kind of letting the shadows fall where they may. I mean, there can be situations, just the way I shoot, I tend not to use it a whole lot. I used to use fill flash in bright contrasty situations, but this was probably about 8-9 years ago. I pretty much don't use it anymore because I feel like the dynamic range on our sensors has become so good that I'm easily able to get detail even in the dark areas if I want to bring it out. So I feel like in most situations it's unnecessary to use a fill flash. Now, a fill flash can be a great tool, especially if you're photographing something that you want to get detail in, as in a certain amount of detail that you may not be able to get otherwise. So in those situations, yes, fill flash would be good, but I personally tend not to use it.
And then we just had a tip from Nigel says backlight can be done most times during the day. You just need to adjust the angle. For example, in midday, shoot at an angle from low or into the trees. And then he said, sometimes I do an auto bracket so I have the images for an HDR.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that as well. Thank you. Okay, so using the light source now, in my photographs, it's mostly going to be the sun. But I'm just referring to it as a light source just because, not everybody here might be photographing just nature. So when I photograph the sun in my photographs, I'm generally paying a lot of attention to the shape of the sun. So as you can see, it looks circular right here. That is the sun. It's obscured by the steam coming off the geyser. But I'm waiting for that moment when I can just see enough of that shape. Now, because the steam was kind of moving through, I had several photos that were blown out. So as in this whole section around the sun was very, very bright and I could not see the shape of the sun. And then there were moments when I couldn't see the sun at all. So this is what I was kind of envisioning when I started to take the photo. And that's what I'm kind of showing you guys. But it's important to note that especially in situations like this, when what's obscuring the sun, the density of it is changing, you may not always get the exact exposure. So it's good to, take a few exposures. And I was kind of watching the sun through the viewfinder. And every time I'd see that, okay, maybe it's visible the way I like it to be, I would take a couple of shots. And of course, in the end, I don't remember exactly how many photos I took to get this exact exposure. And bracketing exposure isn't very useful in this case because you the steam is moving so fast that it would not necessarily mean that you would get the shot. So I much rather went with what I could see through my through the viewfinder, and then kept hitting the shutter. So I ended up probably with about 20 or 30 photos that I needed to look through, but I felt confident that I had the shot. And so this is the one I liked the best because of the way the shape of the sun is visible, but also there's plenty of detail in the steam around, and the exposure is kind of spot on. So one of the things I really like to do, especially not just in backlighting, but I especially in backlighting, I like to photograph the sun when it's very low on the horizon. And what that does is it makes the exposure a lot simpler. And in this case, I'm using this particular situation, and I'm composing where the sun is kind of in this section right between the trees. And that to me seemed like the best place for it to be, because if you look at the gaps between the trees, this is the one with the biggest gap. And so I felt like that's where the kind of the sun belonged in the photograph. And there was a little bit of fog in there as well. So that kind of helped subdue the sun, but it's literally just coming up. There was probably some trees in the back and it's coming up over the trees, but the fog is kind of subduing the brightness of the sun. But as the sun comes up a little higher, at this point now the sun is moving, right? So now I'm changing my composition, and obviously I'm changing my exposure as well, to expose so that I don't blow the sun out altogether. I still am looking at a shape, so I want to get that circular shape. What's around it is more important than trying to expose for the sun. You're never going to be able to expose for the sun. So you get a little bit of color, a little yellow. I'm pretty happy with that. The higher the sun gets, it's very hard to get any kind of color in it. So it'll just generally be white or blown out, which is okay. But as long as you're getting the shape of the sun, I think that works well. Again, compose so that, it's perfectly in this V at the top of the trees. And I've also gone to a vertical composition because I felt that suited this better. Michelle, that was a question?
Yeah. So when you're backlighting, are you working to expose the highlights properly, and then you just let the exposure and the shadows fall where they may?
Yep, that's exactly every photo. That's exactly what I'm doing, because the highlights are the most important thing. You blow those out, you can't really get any detail back in them. So you always want to expose for the highlights. You can always bring up shadows, or you can darken shadows, whichever way you want to go in post-processing. But generally, you want to expose for your highlights pretty much. That's kind of, I would say that's not just how I expose for backlighting. That's pretty much how I expose for every photograph I take. I'm pretty much exposing for the highlights at all times. There might be situations where I bracket and things like that, but generally, I would say 99% of my images, I'm pretty much exposing for the highlights. Is there anything else, or should I continue?
Keep going.
Okay, thanks. So here's where the sun is much higher in the photo, which is a different kind of challenge. And by the way, this is one single photo. This is not a HDR photograph. And this is what I mean by how far our sensors have come, where you can actually see plenty of detail around the sun. And I could even bring out more detail here, but I wanted to leave it like that. But you can see some level of detail in the arch and in the shadows as well. Now, notice down here what my f-stop is at f22. That's what allows me to get this sharp sun star. And I'm using a lens that usually gives me a good sun star. It's the 14 to 24 mm. And I'm shooting pretty much wide at 14 mm, which allows me to get this really wide view. But shooting at f22, basically exposing for the area around the sun. Remember, you cannot expose for the sun. This is still going to be, if you're using your highlight warning, this is always going to be blinking, and that's okay. The important thing is, again, the shape around the sun. You don't want it to look like a blob. You want it to look like a sharp sun star. And the middle part of it will will look a little wider. It's not going to be super sharp, but as long as the um, sun star in the rays coming out of it look sharp, that's usually what you want. What I liked about this image, and I timed this as because I saw these two people. There's one person up there, it's actually a kid, and there's adult down here. They were up here and they actually worked their way around, and I waited for this moment to kind of capture, because one is I wanted to be able to get the implied motion in this person's walk or gait, and so you can see the foot being up. But I also, using the flare in this case to kind of bring your attention right down to the uh, person as well helps. So I'm just trying to get all of that to come together. But to get the sharpest sun star, I would shoot at f22, and I know people are probably thinking f22 you'll get a little bit of diffraction. Yes, you will, but it's kind of a balancing act, and you can, as long as the diffraction is not terrible on your lens, and it does differ from lens to lens, as long as it's not terrible, you should be able to bring enough sharpness back in post-processing. And there's several tools to be able to do that in any case. So f22, I usually don't shoot anything beyond that, but f22 will give you a nice sharp sun star right there.
And how do you protect your eyes and your sensor when shooting into the sun?
Don't look at it for too long. It's the basic way to do it. And as far as the sensor goes, again, I'm not keeping it pointing in that direction for very long. I'm getting my shot and then I'm moving on to something else. And if you're concerned about that, and if you have a specific composition set up and you're waiting for something to happen, you can always put the lens cap on, and when whatever you're waiting for happens, you can kind of take the lens cap off. There's other ways to do it quicker. You could, have a little cloth. You could even use your hand. So there's different ways to do that. But generally, I don't keep the camera pointing in that direction for very long, and neither am I looking in that direction for very long.
And do you use single or group for focus points?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you use single or group for focus points?
Okay, for any kind of landscape photography, I'm using single point. I use a variety of other settings for wildlife because things are moving, so there are different autofocus modes for that. But generally, with a landscape photo like this one, where everything is pretty much static, I'm not trying to track anything. I'd essentially focus like right around here. And I was just waiting for that person to kind of walk through. So single focus point in this case.
And did you spot meter the brightest part of the sky?
Nope, I didn't need to do that. I actually don't use spot metering at all. I simply use evaluative or matrix metering, as it's called in Nikon and Canon respectively. And that's all I need. I just need to look at my histogram, and that tells me all I need to know. So I never feel the need to go to spot metering. It's just so easy to take a shot, take a look, make the adjustment.
Right.
Okay. So similar technique once again, but I'm using a slightly different approach where I'm actually partially obscuring the light source, in this case, the sun, to create that starburst. And the starburst would have been created in the sky too, but it's obviously a brighter sky in this case. But having that sun star appear kind of in between the trees and having that dark background of some of those tree trunks makes it more visible as well. So, and in this case, obviously shadows play a huge part in the composition and setting the mood of the photograph as well. So while it's a similar situation, similar approach, the only thing I'm changing is that I'm partially obscuring the light source. Okay, so this is a moonlit shot. This is Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone. And so I'm essentially using a couple of techniques in combination here. Obviously, the backlighting is a technique, but now I'm using a slower shutter speed. And with the steam rising from the geyser, it's taken at 4 seconds. So while the shutter stays open for 4 seconds, the steam kind of moves through the image and creates that almost this streaking effect that you're seeing visible on the screen. And yes, there's a little bit of flare in here, but I don't mind it so much. I think some people are more particular about that. And in this case, I think it works. So I'm not going to try and remove it. Um, One thing to be very careful, especially when you're photographing any kind of backlit or into the light, especially when the light source is in the photograph, it is so important to always clean the front of your lens. And you'll be surprised that if you don't clean the front of your lens, the flare can be really weird looking, or it can reduce the contrast so much that you'd be surprised that, oh wow, like it looked different through the lens, but actually the camera is capturing something that's like a slightly different from that. The other thing you should know is whenever I'm shooting into the light and I have whether it's having the light source in the photo or not, in a strong backlighting situation, I almost never use filters. Very rarely. I think I have only one photo in this whole presentation where I've actually used a filter. And I'll point that out when we get there. But I just don't, because that's basically adding more glass in front of your lens. And the more glass you have, the more chance that there could be flare, etc. So just to keep that to a minimum, I generally will try and avoid filters altogether unless I feel like it is necessary.
These black and white shots, were they shot in black and white or converted from color?
There is no black and white shot so far.
All right, so they're color.
Oh, this one, sorry. And this one, yeah. So these were all are converted. They're not, this one, I thought maybe you were talking about this one, but this is not black and white. Those two are converted to black and white. Pretty much I shoot raw, so everything that I shoot is gonna be in color. It's always gonna need to be converted. Okay, let's talk a little bit about silhouettes. I mean, this is not necessarily true for all backlit images, but especially for silhouettes, you do want to look for extremely high contrast situations, because that's how you will be able to bring attention to the shape and essentially get the animal or the subject, whatever you're getting in silhouette, pretty much close to black, if not all the way black. And then you can obviously work on that in post-processing to get it to exactly what you want. Now, in this situation, you'll notice there's a few things that I'm doing. One is obviously I'm trying to capture some kind of motion, implied motion anyway. The leg being up and the ripples in the water kind of imply that. But notice where the silhouette is and where the reflection is dead center in the photograph. And in my opinion, this works just fine, just because it being a reflection photo, but also the ripples here, I think, create that little bit of asymmetry in the photograph too. So to me, that works well. I know some people might not like that, but I like images that work and kind of yet break the rules. So I look for these particular situations. And I already talked about a little bit about shape, but the biggest thing about shapes is they have to be recognizable. If they're recognizable, they will always make for good silhouettes. And these are two black skimmers. The last image I showed you, just one bird which had a reflection. I kind of like images that have multiple birds that have in silhouette, because it's much harder to capture forget one silhouette, but like to get two silhouettes that actually are compelling enough and that are worth looking at together. Now, either one of these silhouettes by themselves, I think, could work. Obviously, compositionally, not quite, but I feel like when you put two of these together and have it in the same photograph, I think it works really well. And these are actually two skimmers that were kind of battling each other, and they tend to do that during nesting season. And of course, I always tend to look for colorful skies or colorful backgrounds as much as I possibly can to kind of add more interest in the photograph. And what I mean by that is I'm not just standing anywhere. I will align myself not between, but I'll try and align myself where the action is happening in between myself and the colorful background. And hopefully I'll be able to get some images from there. So there's a little bit of work that goes into getting the right background, but most of the time in these situations, I would essentially look for the background first and then find the right angle to set up and wait for the birds to do their thing.
How much post-processing are you doing to your images? Like how much do you add to them?
Not a whole lot. And I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation as well, if you wouldn't mind asking me that question again. But really, I'm trying to stay true to the moment. And if you do the right things in the field, you don't have to do a whole lot of post-processing. I feel like um, nowadays with digital, it's so easy to kind of just fix things later that we tend to get a little lazy. And I try to keep myself from doing that because I feel like it makes me a better photographer in terms of just being out there in the field and trying to get as close to what I want in the camera. Now, nothing's perfect right out of the camera, especially when you're photographing with a raw file. But so I am doing post-processing. It's just I'm not taking birds, moving them around, or adding things to photos. Obviously contrast and adjustments, color adjustments, things like that. Occasionally, a contrast adjustment could need to be pushed, especially in a backlit situation where I'm trying to get more of a silhouette. And this is one of the things I run into often, especially with silhouettes, where with the dynamic range of the um, sensor, sometimes it's hard to get a silhouette because it's constantly capturing detail in the shadows as well. So in those situations, I will tend to darken the silhouette a lot more than I would have otherwise because I was trying to get a silhouette. So it just depends on what my final product is going to be. But generally, I try and do as little just because I want to spend more time in the field and not on the computer.
And do you use a tripod with the big lens?
Um, Sometimes I use a monopod a lot and I handhold occasionally as well. So it just depends. With the 600 Nikon, I can handhold it for 10, 15 seconds at a time. So usually I'll shoot and then I'll put it down, I'll wait for my arm to feel a little bit better and then pick it back up and shoot again. But that's one of the reasons I like using a monopod. I know a lot of people don't often use monopods, but I find monopods a lot more flexible in terms of changing height, changing positions, etc. I can do that much quicker. Of course, your shutter speeds then need to be a little bit higher, and you also have to get used to the fact that without the tripod and being on a monopod, your viewfinder isn't always the most stable either. Because when you're on a tripod, it can be very stable, while on the monopod, it's moving around a little bit all the time. Okay, I'll continue. So you can always combine silhouettes with the sun to kind of enhance the interest in the photograph. I feel like, the circular shape of the sun, in this case, it's a semicircle almost, I think will always add a whole lot of interest in the photograph because it's another shape. And here, this is a Thompson's gazelle, right on a ridge. And, we were in a Toyota Land Cruiser, and we positioned the vehicle where I felt like the Thompson Gazelle was going to end up going through that area, because if it was moving and if we had stopped exactly where it was and tried to take this photograph, by the time we stopped, got our cameras exactly in position, the gazelle would probably have moved across the photograph. So what I did was I had the driver position the vehicle a little further ahead and then waited for the gazelle to kind of come up, and just our luck that it came up right there next to the sun, stopped and looked right at us. So I was able to get a nice silhouette of the horns, and I'm again looking for all 4 feet. I don't like silhouettes that have only 3 feet. I tend to look for a full shape of the animal, and I don't want parts of it to not be visible. Now in this case, obviously the snout of the animal is not visible, but because it's looking directly at us, you can see the horns and the ears very clearly. So it's a give and take in this situation.
What causes the glow around part of the gazelle?
Oh, that's just the backlighting. That's all that is. It's got a little bit of rim light. It's not like the guanaco because it doesn't have fur. It just has like a very thin coat of. So all that glow is nothing but a little bit of that rim lighting. That's all. And, and then you can obviously frame silhouettes in the sun as well. And this is much harder to do because we're talking about moving subjects, right? I mean, this common turn, I was able to get one shot from that whole morning that I thought was a really good silhouette. I had others where the birds were framed, but the shapes weren't very good. So it's one of those where you could get totally skunked trying for it all morning as well, just because that situation may not occur, or you may not be paying attention, or you may just not hit the shutter at the exact time. So I'm shooting in burst mode, and I'm trying to, as soon as I see the birds flying close to the sun, I'll let off a burst and hopefully be able to capture one of these. And so I like the positioning of this one. The shape of the bird, etc., is nicely visible as well. This is cropped a little bit because, as you can tell, with a 600 and a 1.4 teleconverter, that's at about 840 mm. This would not be the size of the sun. So I've cropped in just a little bit to kind of bring more attention to the silhouette and make that a little larger in the frame as well. And of course, you can always pull out in this situation. I'm trying to include a little bit more of the environment. And by that, I don't mean you need to include a bunch of trees, etc. It's still a very simple shot. This is more about just getting the silhouettes of the snow geese that have taken off. Now, it so happened that this was a sunset shot, but there was a little bit of moisture in the air, which is what creates that glowy effect that you're getting in front of the sun and across the screen as well. And the colors were really nice, but I knew that this was going to happen. Snow geese tend to take off right around sunset. They'll do this blast off, and they'll often circle for a few minutes and then maybe come back down and sometimes blast off again as well. So knowing that was going to happen, I had positioned myself, and they were uh, right here on the beach before they took off. So I knew when they take off and circle that I might get some opportunities to get them in silhouette with the sun in the background as well. So back to Africa, this is in Kenya, and I really like to look for unusual conditions. And again, this is what gives us the opportunity to kind of create a mood in the photograph. And you could say there was some mood in a lot of the photographs that have preceded, but I've chosen not to talk about it earlier. I wanted to kind of talk about it separately because I feel like that's one of the biggest advantages that backlighting offers. It lets you create a certain mood in the photograph. And the unusual situation or conditions in this case was the amount of wind that was there, so that every time these zebras were walking across this dusty area, there would be so much dust coming off their feet that it almost created this fog light effect. So that all the foggy effect that you're almost seeing there is actually nothing but dust. And that's from a very strong wind, probably about 15, 20 mile an hour, maybe even a little bit more than that. And because it's so arid, there's a lot of dust coming off. Notice that all 4 feet of all 4 zebras are visible. Once again, I'm always looking for that. I don't even usually show photos where all 4 feet are not visible. So when you have dramatic light, I think that's a really great situation. And in this case, I have a dark sky, but the light's kind of, when I say I have a dark sky, the whole sky wasn't dark. But what I've chosen to compose and include in this photograph is very dark. But the sun has actually come up and out of it from further above. And that's what created this dramatic light. But I'm using, and this is the only photograph that you see in this presentation, I'm using the Stingray Vari ND filter, because it was so bright, and even at ISO 64 and f22, I'm still not able to get a slower shutter speed. So what I had to do is I had to put that ND filter on. I used it, I think, at close to its minimum settings, which is around 2 stops. And then I was able to set it up on a tripod, and then let the ocean kind of do its things and let the waves break in front. And that's what creates that effect of motion in the foreground. Now, obviously, what's in the foreground is moving much faster or moving more relative to where the camera is. And that's why the ocean in the background does not, even though it doesn't look tack sharp, it doesn't look like it's moving a whole lot. But obviously in the foreground, the wave action is being captured by the 0.4 second exposure. And once again, exposing for the highlights. And there were a few blinking highlights here, but you're always going to get that, especially when you're shooting on water. And it's such strong light. There's always going to be a little bit of that happening. So you just got to deal with that. And as long as it's minimal and it's not dominating the photograph, I feel like it's acceptable. And of course, a more classic kind of view, and using the black and white conversion here, I think helps create that mood. And you did see a couple of black and white photos earlier as well. And in this case, I chose a black and white because first, the sun was getting up fairly high, so there was not a whole lot of color to start off with. But by going to a black and white conversion, I was able to bring out a lot more texture, and it really brings out the shape and the attention to the shape here. And of course, the beams of light as well. Once again, using f22 to get that sharp sun star right there. And that's what creates these sharper rays around the sun. So in this case, I'm actually using the flare to my advantage, because if you think about it, if I didn't have the flare in this photograph, it might still be a photograph worth showing. But by having the flare in the photo, I actually think it goes to another level, because it's actually creating that kind of surreal feel to it, almost like a magical feel where the sunflowers are being backlit. And of course, the shape and the structure of the petals, etc., also to me is very compelling. And that's what I was really looking to bring out in this particular black and white conversion as well, is to make sure that all the dark areas stay very dark, so that the attention goes more to the highlights, which are essentially the petals and the shape of the petals around on the sunflowers. And of course, when you stop down to f16, as I have here, you'll notice that you get more hexagon shaped flare. And that's nothing but a result of the aperture, because as the aperture closes, the shape of the aperture is more visible. And when you stop down, that's essentially what's happening. So when you're shooting wide open, you'll tend to get more circular flare, or even in some cases, circular orbs. When you're photographing, like a dewdrop that's backlit, it'll tend to render more circular. While the moment you stop down, it becomes more hexagon. And in this case, I felt like it was still acceptable, usually because I'm trying to get more circular flare or circular orbs. But because in this case, it's kind of off to the corner, and there's only 2 or 3 of them that are really visible as shapes, I thought it was fine to go with the f16. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to use f16, is to get maximum depth of field as well. So last thing I wanted to cover was challenges. And I've talked about the various challenges that we have, but I wanted to share 2 or 3 ways of overcoming challenges. One is obviously obscure the light source completely. What I'm doing here, and this is taken off a boat, and one of the reasons I'm shooting at such a high shutter speed, because there's also a osprey nest that was in there, and the ospreys were flying around, so I was trying to capture that. So I was set up for that. But as the ospreys moved away, I continued to shoot, in more of a landscape kind of scenario, and using f8 and focusing somewhere right about there. I didn't want to get everything sharp from front to back. Really, what's most important is to get some of the water sharp and of course the tree, which is essentially the subject in there. But notice that you can barely see any bright area even around the tree, just because I've positioned, well, I didn't position the boat perfectly, but as the boat was moving, I was taking photos and making sure that I got the sun fully obscured, and that's why I was able to get a more predictable exposure as well.
Have you ever played with the gold and blue filter that Stingray makes? I wonder what that
Uh,
was.
I did, and I borrowed it from a friend a long time ago. It kind of makes things pretty surreal. And since I tend to try and keep things within the realm of reality, I think it was probably not the best filter for me. But I have seen it used in some situations where it's kind of created these extremely surreal images that can really have a lot of impact. So I would encourage people to try that filter. It's very interesting. It was just not a filter that I would have in my bag consistently, which is why I don't have it.
I'm just looking at the gold of that sky and wondering what it was.
Yeah. Yes, it would. And it would probably make all the water pretty purple too. Of course, HDR imaging, I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, bracketing exposures and then kind of putting them together in software. That's essentially what I've done here, because I was shooting directly into the sun. So to be able to get some detail in here and obviously exposed for the brighter areas as well. This was 3 photos, 1 stop apart, and I brought them into Lightroom. Lightroom does a great job putting that together and actually spews out a um, raw image, which I really appreciate, and I feel like I can, work with that some more if I need to. But it's pretty amazing that Lightroom can spit out, even with the automatic settings, can spit out something that's really pretty close to what I want to start off with. I think that works really well. I just had to make some small tweaks, and that's the result you're seeing here. But that's one of the things you can do is you can kind of bracket your exposures, especially when things are not moving too fast. The clouds are moving here, but I'm shooting in burst mode and taking 3 shots very quickly, one after the other, and I'm able to get the HDR image that you're seeing right here. So one of the biggest challenges that you can face and that can be really problematic is getting this weird thing that's happening at the very top of the frame, if you notice. Now, generally, when you look at a photograph that's backlit or any other photo, the sky tends to have a smooth gradient, if anything. But you notice that this has a very yellow tint here, and then it just goes to a very dark yellow. And what's happening here is nothing but my hood is getting in the way. So because of the angle of light is so steep in this situation, the hood is actually creating a problem in the photograph where it's obscuring part of that. And in this case, all of this loss of contrast is essentially flare. And so I'm trying to use that flare to my advantage, but it's obviously not working because I have this area here. But this is where I feel like you kind of get into these unique situations where you can start to use what is a extremely challenging situation and try and create a unique image. Now, this is not created the same day. This is actually created the next year, believe it or not. This is the same location. And I had learned from that experience where I found that, I was having trouble shooting in certain directions. And so I decided, hey, I'm not going to shoot in the direction that's the most problematic. I'm going to shoot a little bit lower than that. And I'm going to try and get these silhouettes or partial silhouettes and backlit photos where, I can get something that's more unique or has a different look and feel to it rather than a typical silhouette. And so that's something that I always encourage people to do is, take what is a challenging situation and try and make it work for you. And you'll be surprised that you'll come up with some pretty unique images. So thank you. And I'd love to take some questions if there are any.
Sure. If anyone's got more questions, type them in the Q&A window. Bill wanted to know, what head do you use on your monopod?
I have a monopod head, which is essentially a tilt head. I can't remember the exact name, but it's made by really right stuff, and it's got a knob. It uses two knobs. One is the knob for the adjustment, as in how tight and how loose I want it to be, so I can tilt accordingly. And I use the knob also for the quick release system, because I find that if, especially when you're using a 600 lens, which tends to be heavier and bulkier, and we tend to shoot in tired condition when we're tired, because it might be early or late in the day. So I find that, having a quick release system, that just snaps open and then all the weight of the lens kind of comes on you. I don't think that's ideal. I'd much rather slowly loosen the knob up and slide the lens out from there. So I tend to use, and again, I could look it up. If you want to email me, I can give you the exact model number. I just can't recall off the top of my head, but it's a really right stuff monopod head with the screw knob.
I know we've had a few speakers mention really right stuff. I might have to go check it out. Someone put a link in the chat window, so anyone who's interested, there's a link there. Patty wants to know, are you setting your WB temp or use auto and adjust in?
Yeah, pretty much. Since I'm shooting raw, I pretty much use auto white balance. There are very specific situations, and sometimes that involves use of ND filters, especially 5 stops and above, that I might use a manual white balance. But most of the time I'm using a auto white balance, because nowadays the cameras have become so good at getting it pretty close. And I feel like when I'm shooting in raw, I can always go back and tweak it. And nothing I'm doing, is that critical in terms of getting the white balance just perfect. These are all my interpretations as far as the photographs go. So do I want it to be a little warmer? Do I want it to be cooler? I kind of make that adjustment or that decision by myself. So I'm not too concerned about it being a little bit off to start off with, because it's just so easy to make the adjustment later on.
On your ocean shot, would you use a circular polarizer?
You can. In my situation, in that, I think the photo that you're referring to is the one with the where the water in the front with the waves breaking. I think it was like had a lot of motion in the foreground. I could have used the circular polarizer, but it was going to give me only about 2/3 of a stop or so in terms of density. But I needed more density than that. I needed about 2 stops, which is why I chose the Stingray Very ND filter. But yes, you could use a circular polarizer and get a similar effect, but the light will not have to be as bright as it was in my situation.
Do you have any workshops coming up?
I sure do. I'd encourage you to go look at my website. I'm doing a couple of new workshops up in Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, Utah for some red rocks. I have Bosque del Apache for the snow geese, the sandhill cranes, white sands, and I still have one spot open for my Yellowstone winter workshop as well. So if you're interested in that, you might want to grab that last spot.
Check out the website. Bonita said, back to your flock of snow geese at sunset. I'm surprised that the shutter speed of 1/250 was enough to freeze the motion of the flock so clearly. Can you explain?
Yes. So if you, and I'm sure everybody was paying attention to the shutter speeds that I was using for a lot of my action photos, and you probably saw shutter speeds well in excess of 1,000th of a second, mostly 12/50th and above. And those were mostly for birds that were almost filling the frame. Now, when you're much further away from a subject, the relative movement in the photograph is a lot less. And if the relative movement is a lot less, you can actually get away with much slower shutter speeds. I could have actually shot that maybe at about 100th of a second, and it would have still looked relatively sharp. And that's just because the snow geese are so far away and so small in the photo that the relative movement in the photograph is not a whole lot. So I felt like 2/50th was going to be enough. And when I blow that photo up and look very carefully, I see some of the birds that are like very close to me. They're not like super sharp, but again, it's not about getting, especially in that situation, it was not about getting every bird perfectly sharp, but it was more about creating that mood in the photograph. And some birds, may not be tack sharp, but that's okay in my opinion. And again, if that's something that you'd prefer to get, perfectly sharp, you shoot that in that same situation with that same focal length. If you shot at 800 to 1000th of a second, everything would be pretty much tack sharp, because those birds are far away and not moving as much in the picture.
And we had a tip from someone. He said, shoot a general scene shot with an X-ray color checker. If you have any light or color questions, then you can balance or tweak in post-processing.
Yeah, and that works well for those who are really want to get everything accurate in terms of the color and the white balance. I think that works well. As I said, with my photos, they're all interpretations, so I'm not too concerned about getting it exactly the way it was. It's more about how I see it and what it does for me and what I want the mood or the effect to be on the viewer.
Right. And Laura says, when are you coming back to Florida?
I was actually there, but I was there for just a short time. But hopefully next spring I'll be back, and I'll come see you guys.
I think that's it for all of our questions. If you guys want to join us next month, we are doing a boot camp. We're doing 2 webinars, one in August and one in September with Vinnie Colucci. And we're going to be covering photography basics, as well as filter basics. If you are a filter user, join us. You'll learn more. If you're not, you'll learn a little bit about them. But it won't be completely filter based. And the idea of the boot camp 2 months in a row is so we can just dive in a little deeper into some of these subjects. And so we're excited about those webinars coming up. And if you'd like to register, just go to stingray.com/webinars and you can see what's coming up there. And Nikhil, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight. This has been awesome. It's a topic we haven't covered before, and I just love the way you explain your shots.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone. Hope to see you guys around.